thank you everybody for coming out this morning and joining us early on a Saturday in Surrey for our MATE Symposium. I've become kind of known for taking on the first presentation in a lot of the classes. So often I have been the one kind of doing the first presentation in a new course that we've taken together, and today is no exception. I did not ask to be first, but here I am. My paper today is titled Read, Listen, Tell, Teaching Indigenous Stories to Imagine a Better Future. And I'm going to be talking about how to teach Indigenous literatures. Across Canada, the integration of Indigenous knowledge and literature into curricula is becoming an important expectation. However, educators at many levels continue to feel unprepared and uncomfortable to teach and engage in these topics, and there are few resources when compared to other subject areas also covered by the curricula. As I complete my master's degree in the MATE program at SFU, I want to create something useful for the English classroom. Beginning with Indigenous short stories seemed like a great place to start. The new anthology and critical reader, Read, Listen, Tell, Indigenous Stories from Turtle Island, contains plenty of short stories that are an excellent source of study for the high school classroom. First and foremost, they are short, which gives teachers a chance to wade into the water rather than jumping in head first. Even so, they are rich texts that will provide students with an exciting contemporary understanding of Indigenous viewpoints. Based on these considerations, I decided to create a teacher guide or curriculum package to go with these stories as my final capstone project. So which stories to choose? The three stories I chose to examine each powerfully challenge something we thought we knew by foregrounding Indigenous perspectives. Specific stories examined in the curriculum guide are Don Dumont's The Way of the Sword, which is filled with observations of a young Cree girl's perspective, including her love of Conan the Barbarian, who she perceives as an Indigenous hero. Secondly, Thomas King's You'll Never Believe What Happened is always a great way to start, in which King challenges what we know about creation stories and how they shape us. Thirdly, Daniel Heath Justice's Tatterborn, in which he imagines a prequel to L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from a distinctly Indigenous point of view. Each of these stories hold up a mirror to Canada, asking both Indigenous and non-Indigenous readers some pointed questions about the reality in which we live and about the future we envision. I believe these stories are needed in the high school classroom, both because of the new curriculum, which requires teaching Indigenous ways of knowing, and because we need to reimagine the way Canada sees itself and Indigenous peoples. The curriculum package I've developed pairs short stories with other materials, articles by various Indigenous and non-Indigenous thinkers, to provide multiple paths for reading and analyzing these stories. With any luck, this will assist teachers and students in examining and reading and analyzing these stories. Within the teacher guide, each story is designed for a different grade and contains a mini unit plan which links to the new or draft BC curriculum for English language arts. Each also features a proposed scope and sequence, some quick questions for a book club style discussion, and extension activities to build on the stories by incorporating other resources. It has turned into a large work of multiple pages, more than I anticipated. But as a non-Indigenous teacher and scholar with a background in English, French, social studies, First Nations studies, and Indigenous literatures, I passionately believe in talking about the challenges and controversial issues facing Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canada today. For me, opening these conversations in schools is a part of my responsibility as someone living, working, and enjoying life on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. working on this resource guide, I have wondered, how can I respectfully challenge my colleagues, my students, and my communities to step out of their comfort zone? How can I use my studies and experience to better equip teachers to teach Indigenous literatures? First, I have to say I'm not an English teacher. I have written this teacher guide with and for my English teacher colleagues. A shout out to Kevin, Pete, and also to Tucker, who are all nervous about teaching Indigenous literatures. They haven't necessarily benefited from the courses I've been able to take in First Nation studies and Indigenous literatures. At the same time, my colleagues are being mandated by the government to teach Indigenous ways of knowing, while concurrently the government is not investing the time or resources for them to feel proud of their work. Thus, the curriculum package I have written is not necessarily how I would mobilize the knowledge I have gained through my education to teach Indigenous literature. But throughout this process, I have realized that I cannot expect others to learn through osmosis. I cannot just hand them a package and expect them to learn it by tapping it against their head. I've taken a lot of time to read and to learn, and we need something that is more ready and hands-on. So in this case, the teacher guide has been written as an introduction, rather than a comprehensive plan for how to teach Indigenous literatures. In her seminal work, Braiding Histories, Learning from Aboriginal People's Experiences and Perspectives, professor and author Susan D. Dion explains a project that her and her brother, Michael Dion, engaged in to disrupt molded images of Indigenous peoples. I highly recommend this book for those embarking on a path to better understand how the current education system, often despite good intentions, is continuing to promote a stale and dehumanizing image of Indigenous peoples. Dion writes that between her time in school and her children's, not much changed about the molded images Canada teaches about Indigenous people. She writes, and I quote, "Lessons focused on Western anthropology's interpretation of material culture as it existed prior to European contact, which reproduced the discourse of the romantic, mythic other, and as such, nurtured a kind of remembering to forget." Dion refers to this as a sort of historical amnesia, where the way we teach Aboriginal knowledge is as if it is based only in the past, with no continuity to today. I can affirm from my own experiences that units about Indigenous nations in social studies classes are frequently focused on pre-contact culture and are often couched in between chapters on the environment and geography, reinforcing that romantic notion of Indigenous people as both at one with nature and unable or unwilling to evolve towards civilization. Although teachers' units may be well researched and engaging for students, Dion counterposes that they reinforce harmful stereotypes while also leaving students ill-informed and ill-equipped to understand how we have arrived at the current state of affairs between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canada. My experience has been that many teachers simultaneously feel overwhelmed by the amount of work they already have and a lack of time and space to learn new topics. Dion encounters similar feelings when she trains teachers and teacher candidates. According to Dion, when she asks educators to reflect on their relationship to Aboriginal people in Canada, she says, and I quote, "Their responses went something like, 'Oh, I know nothing. I have no friends who are Aboriginal. I didn't grow up near a reserve. I didn't learn anything in school. I know very little or nothing at all about Native people.'" Dion says that in one way or another, teachers, like many Canadians, claim the position of perfect stranger to Aboriginal people. Many educators and students will read this quotation by Dion and see themselves mirrored in her statements. Hopefully, upon further reflection, educators will recognize the problematic nature of consciously remaining a perfect stranger to the Indigenous people on whose traditional territories we all reside. Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie explains that there is a danger when we have a single story about a group of people. She discusses that because she grew up only reading Western literature, when she first started writing as an author, she did not believe that people like her, a middle-class girl from Nigeria, belonged in literature. She explains that this is not an innocent mistake. It is about how geopolitical power impacts what we read and what society values. She explains, like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nakali, which loosely translates to mean to be greater than another. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. When we have a singular and definitive story of a group of people, such as Indigenous people, we are back to what Dion described as molded images. Many teachers have a desire to teach diverse literature that mirrors the gender, race, and ethnicity of our students. However, if we have few or no Indigenous identified students in our classrooms, why is there a new push towards Indigenous literatures in all classrooms? Why does it matter? As educators, we must not only understand the beauty and wealth of these texts as literature, we also have a responsibility to understand the harmful and violent history of colonialism in Canada and its consequences for Indigenous people today. It is unlearning a lot of what we think we know of these molded images and single stories that means teaching Indigenous literatures takes more time, more respect, and has more responsibility. Luckily, a new book has been published on this topic by Daniel Heath Justice. In Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, Justice powerfully argues, this to me is the fundamental reason why Indigenous literatures matter. They reflect the truths of our survival and our own special beauty in the world to which we belong. They don't hide the traumas or the shadows. They don't make everything neat and tidy, or presume that the horrors of colonialism will be easily put to rest. Like zombies, vampires, and ungentled ghosts, settler colonialism is nothing if not persistent. But our literatures remind us that our histories are more than tragedy, more than suffering, more than the stories of degradation and deficiency that settler colonialism would have us believe. Here, Justice makes an argument for the literary beauty, breadth, and importance of Indigenous literatures and authors. However, he also touches on something of the critique often hurled at Indigenous literature, its supposed darkness. This perception may also have an impact on teachers' choice of Indigenous literature, or their worry of confirming rather than challenging stereotypes when one's knowledge is limited. I would like to further contend that non-Indigenous people in Canada have a responsibility to read more content written by Indigenous people themselves. Professor, author, and publisher Gregory Younging talks about the concept of Indigenous voice, which is a unique mode of cultural expression that draws from a blend of traditional and contemporary sources. In the Canadian context, Indigenous voice has been overshadowed since the establishment of this colonial nation state. Instead, we read stories written and published by non-Indigenous people about Indigenous people, which often misrepresent them. For example, there are plenty of resources written by survivors of the residential school experience made for children and youth. Yet today, many teachers are teaching the late non-Indigenous musician Gord Downey's Secret Path, which you'll learn more about today, because of their underlying love for the tragically hip. I urge teachers to raise up voices that have not been heard in Canada's schools, and to take the more challenging road less traveled. This is what we are often coaxing our students to do. So why are we as educators not willing to do it ourselves? In her conclusion to Learn, Teach, Challenge, Approaching Indigenous Literature, Approaches to Indigenous Literature, Professor and settler scholar Sophie McCall reflects on 4 approaches she witnessed speakers model at a panel on Indigenous literary studies. She finds them useful in her teaching practice. And I quote, "The speakers modeled for the audience the importance of positioning oneself in relation to knowledges, building relationships between and across boundaries and cultures, languages, territories, disciplines, and academic fields of study, turning inward to unlearn the shaping role of one's foundational assumptions, experiences, and training, and practicing collaboration as a way to further challenge the horizons of one's own necessarily partial perspectives and interpretive frameworks." Here, McCall echoes many non-Indigenous academics in the field, from Sam McKegney to Helen Hoy. Each reminds us of the importance of community connections and responsibility. While we can teach stories from Cherokee writers, Anishinaabe writers, or Plains Cree writers, we also have a responsibility to connect our students with the Indigenous nation on whose traditional lands we reside. While teaching these contemporary stories is a good way to put to rest the single story our students may have of Indigenous peoples, if we want to take responsibility beyond just fulfilling the curriculum mandate, we must do more. McCall's proposed 4 guiding concepts, positionality, rationality, self-reflexivity, and collaboration, ask us to go beyond literary analysis and history to understand instead our connections, or lack of connections, to Indigenous voices in Canada. Dion asks her readers how it came to be acceptable or appealing for people in Canada to claim the position of perfect stranger, and how educators can disrupt it. The question thus becomes not what to teach, but how to teach. What does it mean to teach Indigenous literatures? How is it different than other literature? Why does it carry with it responsibilities? I hope I have already provided the answers to some of these questions in my presentation. But the next question I ask is about the future. How can Indigenous literatures help us to imagine a better future for Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships? How do we disrupt molded images? How do we decolonize the curricula? It's too bad that I don't have more time to tell you about that today. However, if your interest is piqued, and especially if you are an educator or teacher, I hope that you will reach out and get a copy of the curriculum guide that I've been working on so that we can discuss, analyze, and plan, and use stories that help us as teachers, along with our students and broader community, to begin to answer these questions and forge a new path forward together. Thank you.